So for this episode, we're going to focus on dealing with configuration. So oftentimes what we have in situations are, configuration files that we have to manage. And traditionally we'd start out by sort of writing content to a file, then maybe using a template to sort of manage that file. But sometimes it seems like, the possibility of creating your own domain-specific language within Chef would make that possibly easier to manage using custom resources and things like that. And that's what we're going to explore in this section, because it's going to allow us and possibly other individuals that use the cookbooks and the content we create to be able to configure that configuration file, to be able to specify that configuration file more appropriately. So let's do the intro and get started. So it's a little bit different here, so hang on, everybody. All right. All right. Normally that's the time where I'm like running between, running between like my one camera to my second camera, setting up my desktop and going crazy. But in this case, it's enough crazy stuff going on. So what's that?
I said, then the picture-in-picture is.
Yeah, the picture-in-picture, we got a little bit of that. I'm joined by Chef Rockstar, Matt Stratton, who wanted to join me today. Thankfully, he's the one that's helping me figure out some of these new technical hurdles that come along with it. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for coming along for this
Thanks.
journey.
It's a lot of fun. It's always fun to be a guest on somebody else's show. And
this is
your opinions and let everybody else can be in charge.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. Yeah, as you said, sidewalk monitor. What was that?
Sidewalk superintendent.
Sidewalk superintendent. Right. So exactly. So like I said, in this session, we want to deal with looking at, like configuration. So this is something, how often have you seen this? Like, it feels like whenever I'm teaching, and I'm going to start doing some background stuff, whenever I'm teaching or working with individuals, dealing with Chef, is that immediately, like right away, you solve the first problems of packages, services, but immediately get into configuration, and that's when it gets tricky. Appending additional content to a file, managing a file with Chef. And in your experience, have you seen something like that and sort of worked with that in a lot of ways?
Absolutely. I mean, it's pretty common because that traditional Holy Trinity is great for the simple stuff, but most of our world isn't that simple. So you get a lot of, custom applications or saying, hey, I want to manage Java property files or something like that. And where it gets complex is that it's also the ability of kind of abstracting away the different levels of it as well. Like saying, well, I want to be able to control just this part of the file. I get that one a lot, right?
Yeah.
That particular scenario, they're like, okay, I only want to be able to, like I said, only want to be able to control this part of the file or prevent people from controlling other parts of the file, so to speak.
Right.
And that's where I think we can definitely help with that. There's two ways to go about that. One way is to try to go and manipulate one particular line in a file as you go. Or I think the way we're going to talk about a little bit today is figuring out how to leverage custom resources in our own, like you said, organizationals, DSL.
Yeah.
For the stuff that's special about our org.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, like you said, let me actually pull up some of my own sort of dirty laundry and sort of talk about what you're discussing. Because what I've seen, so for Chef, I maintain a lot of the training workstations, and I do so with Chef recipes to set those machines up, those instances up for people. And one of the things that I do for setting up these machines is enable password authentication, really low security, mostly because we're doing demo machines that are available for the day. And in this recipe, I do some things like, where is it? Oh, I was this right here. So I go through the SSH config file right here. And when I make that change to the SSH config file, for this really quick and dirty solution, this works, right? It just kind of like make a one-line change. But this is something that doesn't really grow very well, right? I even put a note to myself, like, this is quick and dirty. And that's the thing that I think you usually start out with. That's kind of what you're talking about, right? Like that thought of like, you manage one line of a file, and then you're kind of needing to grow to a bigger sort of like, how do I manage multiple lines? And how do I deny people or enable people to write to the file?
And how do you make it easy for people who do, like, in order to do this, I have to actually really understand that SSH config file, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to know what I'm going to set versus, whereas I might be someone who doesn't have the deep understanding of how that file is constructed, but I have a couple dials that I need to be able to turn on it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's what I want to focus on. I think as an exercise, I think that'd be great to see, which is either the SSH deconfig, either, you know, that kind of file, setting up sort of password authentication, or just even your personal sort of configuration file. So I know from my own personal experience, like the configuration file, I've used that one. And I don't have much experience with the SSH deconfig, but I don't know where you think it would be interesting to start.
So I think what we could do is we could try to manage a personal one.
Okay.
And just try to think. The thing is, what we want to think about is what is going to be generic, and then what is going to be, for lack of a better word, overridden.
Okay.
So if you're going to say, so where this could come into play, and I may paint myself into a corner with this example, is maybe we say in our organization, there are some things that we want everybody's SSH config file to have.
Right, exactly.
And then, but then potentially I might want to be able to add in a parameter. We might want to be able to expose a parameter that can be user specific.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would do in that case is we'd say, okay, we're going to start by saying, let's have it so that all that the resource doesn't take any parameters. I can just grab it as a resource that will create an organizationally approved SSH config file for me. And then we can look at how we can add functionality to it to expose some more attributes to that particular resource to tweak to it.
Okay. All right. So this is kind of like where, you know, like if we had an SSH config file, let's just say for maybe the root user, not a great example in terms of the root user, but like initially I would probably do this, right? I would probably set up a directory for that root user to have a .ssh. I'd have some sort of config file, and then I'd actually define whatever that content that you're kind of talking about that would be global, right, that are applied to it. That'd be the super simple sort of version of it.
Right. That's the most basic, where everything exists in that one recipe.
Right. Everything exists in the recipe. So what's the kind of content here? Like, should we just put in like some sort of fake host information or kind of go right here? Like if I were to say, and I'll use a slightly different sort of character to start and begin this, but you know, I could say, well, the host is going to be everything. And then are you familiar? Like, I would say like, well, let's go with host everything, forward agent no. You know, if I sort of found some global options that I like, that's what I could probably put in there, right? Like, it's going to be port 22 on that machine, that kind of stuff. That seems like probably a sort of the basic.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at it, is there's things that I do, like I just pulled up my own config file,
right?
Which is mostly for my purposes is about lazy, as is most things. So, for example, I would do like a host, and then I might point to an identity file.
Yeah,
you know, because I don't use passwords for everything.
Right. Like so this could be build server or something, right? And then
it would say host build server identity file points to a certain key file or PEM. Then the host name would be the actual host name of it, and then the user. So that gives me that ability, right? And to be able to say SSH build server, SCP build server. That's super useful. So what we might think about in this example would be if there were certain servers that we knew everybody needed to be able to get at, right? Like, so we were gonna, like you said, in this case, you could do. So I think what you've got is that's a good start. Perfect, right? Like this is saying, okay, we know that this is common stuff that should be everywhere. And right now, let's just pretend that these values are legit, right?
Yeah.
What I would add in is a host name, because we don't know that build server. The parameter is lowercase host name.
Lowercase name.
And identity file and user are also lowercase.
Okay. So
And
host
so
name this,
I
right?
don't think it actually matters now that I think about it, because
Yeah, but
obviously
it
that
would be something
example
like
shows.
this, right? So yeah.
Correct, right? Yeah, but it's good. This is another place where it's what this is going to let us do is make sure that things are consistent, right?
Hmm.
In our convention, for whatever reason,
Yeah.
that we want to be in lowercase or uppercase or whatnot.
Okay. Well,
Okay, so this should work,
yeah,
right?
let's
I'll give
go
you
with,
my config file.
yeah, let's,
There's a
uh,
couple things that I'm thinking you might be missing.
oh,
I don't
sure.
know how big of a deal they'll be. I don't think that um,
Let me, well, you,
permissions super matter, but you might want to think about that. The permissions of your .ssh directory and the permissions of your
sure.
config file.
Right. That should be something that we would definitely want to take a look at. And so that's something like, I think we want like mode 600 or something like that
Yeah.
for the thing, and then for the file as well. That's for sure.
Yep.
And then I think the one thing we want to do is, of course, verify that this is actually true, right? So we could say like, yeah, this should work, but let's actually make it work or prove that it works by running, say, like the default spec. So here's an initial test I was kind of playing around with, but let's add a test that actually says this, right? So I'm going to be using service spec mostly because that's still the default. And I'll harp on that until someone in the community steps up and makes the change, or one of us finally gets enough time at Chef to make that change.
It's close to the default to do inspect, though. It's in the generator. You just have to uncomment it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, and then you got directory structures. There's a few little details that kind of go around it. I did an episode where we did that, kind of worked around. So in this case, I'm going to specify a file, and I'm going to say, hey, the root file has SSH right there. So that's the file we're interested. Here's the simple one. It should exist, right? Like that's a great one. And then its content should match. And what we're hoping for is just something out of there. And I'm not saying we have to get it perfect or right at this moment, but we want to make sure that, maybe user builder is present or something like that. And make sure we got the file in there.
Right. Yeah. Just something that we know is probably not there yet, but at least we proven out our theory.
I believe since I ran this previously, it's currently not in that state. So we should see a failure. So I kind of did a little pre-cooking before the show started. I got that virtual machine up and running. And we'll see here, it doesn't look like it has any content. And we get a good failure, which is this failure from my other little program that lets me do a little.
This is the red in our red-green refactor, right?
Yeah, red and the red-green refactor. Yeah, I make sure that I know that, what I'm doing is doing the right thing. So yeah, we got a good failure here. So that looks good. All right, so let's actually apply this to the system. So that's one thing I never thought about. What I really like is that, you can write the recipe, then you could write the test. And of course, if you have the machine running, Kitchen Verify doesn't, reconverge it. So you have a chance to kind of see that red-green refactor to kind of see it work right. Yeah, that looks good. So it looks like we created a file, root ssh config, and it looks like it added our content like we would expect it to, right? That looks about right. All right, so
looks good to me.
Yeah, and then Kitchen Verify. Let's see what happens here. So this is the basic setup, and this is generally where you would start. And so starting from this kind of, that's why we need this test here. Its content should match this user builder. It's telling us that, you know what? I don't think I specified the right file. I think I specified the directory.
You're looking in the file called .ssh, not a file called config.
There we go. That's why we have these tests to tell us how wrong we are.
We need tests for our tests.
Yeah, we do. There we go. Right, and let's just make sure this is, user build will work. Build EE. Something else, just to kind of see a failure. I like to make sure I see a failure because
we're testing our test.
Yeah, there we go. Looks good. Okay, so I feel confident, and that looks like the content. What I love about the test here too is we get a lot of good feedback that tells us exactly what's going on. All right, so that feels good. So this is our starting point. I'm going to go back to just the recipe, and we'll come back to kind of the test. Yeah, this is the moment where, of course, I think the first refactor, and tell me how you feel about this, would be to move this content into a template right away, right? That would be the easiest sort of thing to do.
Absolutely, I would start with that immediately. And this is I'm again, since this is the show where I guess we can wax philosophical about.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
So I am generally of the opinion. So the question could come up immediately. The first thing that someone might say is, why don't I just use cookbook file? right? Why use a template?
Yeah, right.
And because I do get this a lot where they'll say, so I shouldn't say they, where people, customers, folks I'm working with say, hey, we never changed this file. Why should we make it a template? Couldn't we just use cookbook file? And my answer usually is none of us have a crystal ball. So you may never change it today. But if you get to the point when you say, oh, I'm going to have a one-off, in order to change a cookbook file to a cookbook template, you're changing logic now. So you're testing kind of plain is a lot more complex versus just simply going in and changing what's happening in the template, right? I have to change two things. The other thing is I think this has been kind of debated that there's a very tiny overhead of template over file, but I think it's so minuscule that nobody really runs into it. But that's really the only argument that I can see for using file over template is a tiny little performance thing that if you have that problem, you have that problem.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
I always default to template is my theory on that.
Yeah, and I just, the quick rule for me is if it's text, make it a template because you're likely going to put some content in it. That's that's exactly like you're thinking. You're not going to do that for something else. So usually the transition process for this is just copy this content over, and this is much better too because formatting wise, this gets ugly. My biggest complaint, sort of visually looking at this content, is like, I have to sort of build this in to make it like here. It also, what we don't realize is it added a new line character here. So really, when it created this file, it actually created it to look like this. That's not a problem with SSH config, but could be a problem with other files, which say, hey, unexpected empty line on line 1 or something like that, and you might not have realized it.
You don't have that predictability.
Yeah, so what I love is writing it in its own sort of native format and escaping out to Ruby when I need it. So let's delete all this, which is great in the refactor here. We can do a template, and we now just specify a source. So I'll put this source in, and this we just mentioned. I was kind of doing a little work there while you're talking, which I like. That was good to kind of get that done. And I appreciate, wax philosophical all you want. This is what this show is all about. All right, so I generated that template using the chef generate command. Move the content over and switch over to the template resource. Let's converge and verify again. What do you do for this? I just do this right here, but is there any kind of trick? Do you have an alias or something like that?
I tend to create an alias to, so I do like I alias KV to kitchen converge and kitchen verify.
Oh, okay.
And I have, just for my own sanity of doing that, I had this thing in my head that I thought verify implied converge for the longest time, like that was a thing that was true, and it never was.
Yeah. It's only, it's true for the first run.
First time. Yeah,
the
exactly.
first run, and only the first run. And then I think that kind of gets you into thinking that it does. And that caught me quite a bit because I kept telling people the same thing, like, yeah, when you run verify, it'll converge it. But it was really just the first time because I was only doing it one time and one time only. So I was
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So I think that what we got here is going to work, but it's working in a kind of a cheater way because we're manipulating the root user. So I was thinking about ownership of these directories and these files because they need to be owned by the user. Now, if we don't specify a user, they're going to be owned by root because that's who chef runs as.
Sure.
And in that case, that's actually what we want for this particular one, but that's going to burn us a little later when we want to make this work better for multiple users. So
yeah, you're right.
I'll say we can put that in the back of our mind for the moment.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, it's like, so when we write these files, so the example you're talking about is if we were to say, hey, for, say, if we created a chef user, right? And is it home, not home, users? Or is it home? It's home. Most Linux, I guess, depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking about kind of the same Linux system we're on, it'd be home/chef. This is what you're talking about. This would be owned by root.
Root, and then you'd have a bad day.
Right, exactly. And so this would have to be the owner would be chef. But then how would we sort of consistently be able to set those? Right, that's the kind of thing.
And I think we're going to get to that in a minute. That's part of. I'm getting a little ahead of us ourselves with the refactor. So
right. Well, that's good. Okay, so yeah, why isn't this good enough? This is the thing that I like to talk about, sort of wax on. It's like, this is the thing where, to me, I've seen this before. Like, I could give you this cookbook, right? I could give you this SSH cookbook, and everyone in the organization or everyone on my team or in an open source community could use it, but then they're stuck with the template that I built. So we could make this a little bit more modular, I think, with like variables, right? So we could, do a little bit of like ERB templating, use that power to pass in some content. And I've seen it done that way with, node attributes being sent to templates as variables and then sort of building that content out. So I don't know if you'd be interested in seeing it. I'd like to walk through that.
I think so. And then
Okay.
that will actually bring us to why we would not want to do that.
Yeah. All right. So
yeah, not to be a spoiler, but
no, that's
seeing
good.
how that would look, because you're talking about like saying, how would I, would those be things that maybe came from an attribute? Like the idea being, so this is fine, that sets it for everybody, but the rest of the use case is, hey, in my SSH config, I actually need to also put in my dev server that only I care about, Matt server. I want to append that into my config as well, because if I go into my config by hand and add it, Chef's going to go and whack it the next time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So if I had, like you said, if they were attributes that I could set, that I think that would be a way to solve for that, right? We're saying, okay, so I can set hosts that have, the value of that would be the host name and then the user and then the identity file. And we could even, for lack of, we could make identity file always be the same. We're going to assume in our enterprise, you use the same identity file for everything.
Right.
Just to make your life a little easier, to have one less thing to do.
This would just be the general sort of thought, right? So now I'm just kind of taking all that data that is kind of present inside of that file and making it, attributizing it in this case. And normally you wouldn't put it here inside of the recipe, right. But there's no sense of going into another file for our purposes. Okay. And then identity file, and you could say, yeah, we can make that the same for everything. So
actually, yeah, you might as well go ahead and make, although since you're going to make it the same for everything here, we might as well make it an attribute.
Okay. And so we'll just say it's always at your home file, something like that.
Yeah, that's fine. Because that's something someone could change later if for some reason is an attribute. Okay, so now
what I've done is I've created an array of hashes. The only thing is I've only created one item in this array. Right now in the future, I could put more items in here, but we just got one. And I'm going to pass that with variables. And with variables, I'm just going to pass, this content right here, right? So I'm going to say hosts and then give them that content, right? So that would be the same thing here. So that does that seem right? That seems like the right thing. So I've got the content here in the array. I'm giving the array in a variables now inside of the template. And the traditional thing is, if I've got this host here, then inside the template somewhere, I should be able to use it with the ERB tags like this. Like, let's just do this wrong to kind of just see this do it. I like to see a good error message. So I'm going to just write out the content and see what it looks like. So I'm passing this host thing into here, and then it's going to write this out. And I need to
write what it thinks hosts is equal to.
Yeah, and I think that that should give us a failure. And what's nice is in this way of kind of doing this step here, we actually see the source code that got written out. Like, what actually did that turn that into? And this is what got written to the file. We removed these lines of content, right? I took that out. And then it actually wrote this, which is I took a Ruby array of a hash and just wrote that out to the file.
Shoved it in there.
Yeah, which is not it might make it pass actually, because our content's there. It probably doesn't because it doesn't. So our test is actually worth it. So
it doesn't because you're testing for, oh no, you're right.
Yeah, I thought for a second it would because it would be like hostname space. But remember, it's looking for, I believe,
for
user
space, right.
Yeah. So this does catch it. So the thing is, we've got this Ruby array here of all the hosts, and this is where we need to say for every host, and this is where it gets a little trickier. So then we have to close this, really, actually, I kind of like writing this. Let me write this outside of this ERB, because ERB kind of gets in the way in my head. So if I had this, I'd be writing something like this. Host
I would do it in the recipe.
Each do host. And for every host, what I want to do is write out something like, host, then the host name, which I believe we've got right here. So I'd be able to say something like host name. And then in indented two spaces, I would say something like host name. And then this would be grab me the host, grab the host name, right? That's the kind of thought.
And then you're going to shove the result of all of this into the template.
Yeah, I'm just kind of writing it out here. I don't know if this is I don't know if I like this.
In this case, I know where you're coming from by not wanting to do it in the ERB, but I think it's a little
clean
ERB actually.
Let's go there. All right. Without so that's kind of like what I have here, and then we'll dress it up with the ERB tags is what maybe I think you were applying, and I think that's the way to do it. Yeah, this feels right. So write it here. So
where you would just to say where you would potentially do what Franklin was showing about doing it in the recipe would be as if each time maybe it was a different file, like a vhost file or something like that.
That's true.
Since we're shoving it all into one file.
Yeah.
Because you're going to end up with that same needing to do like a sed or a line write or something like that.
Right, exactly. So this, of course, won't work right away, right? So, I could say at hosts each, but remember this is now SSH config language, not the Ruby part. So we need to escape out to the Ruby part. So I'm going to spend the time, I'll just delete this. The thought was I need to now take sort of that Ruby and then surround it with these tags, right? So I have to go and add all this around that content. And then it's the same thing here. Let's indent this back here. And then same thing here. Every one of these is all based on the host variable in Ruby. So I need to actually use, as I refer to it, the angry squid to display that content. All right. And then the ice cream cone at the end. All right. And that looks about right. I think that's right.
This should pass.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we would refactor this too. So now I'll run kitchen conversion verify. We should see this updated. Ooh, we should, but we don't, and that's good. So it's telling us we have a syntax error, and it's telling us there's an error here. Unexpected syntax. There's a looks like a parenthesis, unexpected parenthesis inside of
unexpected
something here.
Curly, expecting a paren.
Yeah, unexpected. Yeah, curly. Yeah, right. All right, let's take a look back at this code here. So you know what it is? It's this. So this is one error that I see a lot, is that you oftentimes get into what I'll call a happy angry squid, like you're just dropping angry squids everywhere. And you don't want that. Like that's this content right here, the each loop, you don't want to actually display that, I believe, right? You want to display these lines.
Don't we also want to, for cleanliness, ensure that, because right now those lines are going to introduce a blank line, correct, into our host file?
Oh, yeah, let's see, actually. I've been reading.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, this is a good point to ask about, because like there's a way that you can sort of say remove those. Let's see what the output looks like.
I think that's the flamingo squid, right? The
flamingo squid. I don't actually think it's necessary in the later versions of Ruby. And we could take a look at it. Here's what it deleted. Yeah, here's what it deleted, and here's what it added. So I think the file is okay. I don't think it added those new line characters. And then I think we got our passing test again. But I love what you're suggesting. Let's log in, because that's a question that comes up quite a bit. And I'll just become the root user. And as a root user, I'm just going to cat the contents of our newly generated. I don't know if my home is.
We'll find out. It is.
Yeah,
yep, so it's fine.
Yeah, I think that was an old Ruby 187 thing that's sort of just been hanging around. And I know that as someone that used to put together.
Happy Trails Flamingo Squid.
Happy Trails Flamingo Squid. I called it like sprinkles on the top or something like that. Okay, so that feels pretty good, right? So now the idea here is, in the future, I could now define more of these, right, as necessary. So we have something like the build server. We might have something like the artifact server, right, like some other server that we pull content from. This is the artificer, right? That kind of needs that information. And again, if we do kitchen, I'll log out. And we do kitchen converge and verify, we'll see some content change in that file. And what will benefit from here, what we'll see is a new host name being added, right? Which is great. We have a new host name added. We might even write a test about that. But that feels pretty good as far as managing that configuration in data. So this is something, of course, we could move into another cookbook, in a sort of wrapping cookbook.
Yep,
you can move it into
a recipe on this if you were building a workstation cookbook or.
I mean, it could be in a data bag as far as that content goes. How do you feel about this in terms of configurability? So this is something that, I've seen for sure, and this works pretty well. I mean, I feel like you get a lot of good mileage out of this. You get a lot of good, like, you notice here, this is flexible, adaptable, and things like that. I don't know if, I think we should still see a custom resource, but I feel like this covers a lot of cases if you're starting to work with configuration and you're kind of building a configuration file that you want to have a little bit, be a little more dynamic, right?
Right. This would definitely get you there. And so if we think a little bit about the use of this, so if I'm someone that wants to leverage this, in another cookbook or another recipe that I'm writing, I would then do that by doing an include recipe, right? And then that would take this. But now I also have to know. So here's where some of the challenge comes in, though.
Oh, yeah.
So what I need to know is I need to understand this thing a little bit better, right? So I'm going to need to not only do include recipe, I'm going to have to know which attributes I need to set in order for it to work. So let's think about what the point of a custom resource is versus just the point of a resource at all. So what if and maybe this is going to be kind of making an example that becomes ridiculous, but let's think about, for example, the user resource in Chef. What if instead of being able to say user and then, setting the attribute, the parameters around it of username, home dir, all that stuff, I had to instead say include recipe, chef, : user, and then set attributes on my node for all the information about all the users that I wanted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
That's kind of making me, as the person who's writing, who wants to leverage that, it's not letting me treat it like a resource. It's just another thing I can do. So in this case, again, we've kind of taken something very simple, and this one probably would work okay in the case of managing someone's personal SSH config file. But I want to think about kind of a larger, and we'll still cover this with the we'll take this out to a resource, but think about the scenario of, I always like to think about Tomcat, for example. Let's say you run Tomcat in your organization. There's hundreds of configurable parameters in an instance of Tomcat, right?
Yeah.
I probably don't want, if I'm the middleware admin, right, I probably don't want everybody who's going to build an instance of Tomcat in my environment or in my infrastructure to be able to twiddle with all the dials and knobs. There's some things that I want to make consistent. Similarly, as the person who's leveraging it, I don't want to have to know about the hundreds of dials and knobs. I really care about 3 of them. So what I want to be able to do is have a resource called like my org Tomcat that presents those 3 parameters that I'm allowed to change or that I care about changing. And that way I can store the code that creates it in a different repo that gets tested as a library. And I'm not talking like Chef library. I just mean like something that's leveraged as a component. The whole idea is turning it into a component that gets used without having to really understand how the sausage gets made.
Right. Yeah, and this is kind of like, at the beginning of your conversation, you were saying this is like how I might use it from an external perspective. I'd come through, I'd have a recipe in another cookbook. I'd perhaps override some variables, if I'm doing the wrapper cookbook model, and then I'm doing this sort of include recipe to actually generate this content like in this file for yourself. But I think you bring up a great concern, which is like, we're specifying this data and we're giving everyone the ability to write to that file any data they possibly want. There's also like kind of thinking about that as well. There's not a lot of, of these tunable areas, because really we're saying you can change the host, right? You can specify different values for the host. Tunable area we're okay with you setting, and this feels pretty good. The thing is, we don't have a lot of validation on this as well, right? There's no content validation whatsoever. So I could put in whatever I wanted here and make a mistake, and anyone that pulls in the recipe, it's on them to make sure that they get it right. And it would be nice if, again, like a custom resource would give us that security in some cases of like allowing certain individuals, not security, but like, access, the right access to the confidence to it, right?
Or like we said, let's say, for example, and I'm going to miss it because I'm not thinking of the right parameter, but that there's a parameter in the config that says only don't try password auth, right?
Okay.
Or something like that, right? That we want to ensure, like in this case, we're allowing all of those things to be tuned, right? And we're probably going to build our resource that way. But let's say there was a 4th parameter that we wanted to make sure that every host configuration included, but we didn't want it to be changeable.
Mhm.
So that's where we were only tuning those knobs. Or like you said, this actually allows it to shove in any attribute that it wants. So I could create, I could say, add instead as another parameter, my exploit or whatever kind of thing. Maybe I don't know how you would do that, but
Yeah. Well, let's work through that. So we've got a few more minutes, and I'd love to work through kind of converting this into a custom resource. So this kind of functionality that we started out with. And then I created this sub recipe here where I was kind of doing this, but I think then we'll use the custom resource inside of here, maybe build a test suite, test that one out, or play with it, but kind of see how it's used. So in the sort of dream-driven development way, it seems like what I would do is specify something like SSH config, right? And I'd specify who this belongs to. We could say like the root user. And then I would say, let's add a host for them, right? Like let's just add a host. Because that's really all this content is up here, right? Which is saying, hey, let's grab this host information here. So really, I want to maybe take that information and maybe define it here or something like that. So let's just say here, I've got a host, and it's going to be the build server. And then I guess what we would need to do is, of course, the name would have to be, I guess we could just take all this information right here. I guess I could do that. That's one way of doing it. So let's see how we feel about that. So that's kind of one implementation. Another implementation we maybe could choose or something like that is we could say, of course it's for root, but we could say something like maybe the host is specified here. So this is build server, right? Or maybe we call it like SSH config host. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, and I'm not sure. That's where, we could say, well, it's for the host. What user is it for? We could say the root user. And then we could say, well, let's define each of these out, right? So that we have all these fields sort of written out. We could say something like this, like name, build server, host name, right? So there's some choices here as far as, whoops. User is not a good name because I realize now that I have to have this user field. But that's what we try this out and sort of see what we can do here. So user is maybe not the right one here. Maybe we'll just assume it's for the root user at this moment. But that's another way we can do it. I don't know. The one thing that seems important here is that we want to make sure that this works for the root user. We want to make sure that we have the host information that kind of gets added to the file. It seems strange to sort of define it this way. Again, it seems like we're just kind of, I don't know. In some cases, this feels like all I'm doing is really masking the thought of like creating this file, right? If I say this, what I really mean is you don't care about the implementation, whether it's root, SSH config, right? That's going to be assumed by this file right here. The next thing, that's going to be assumed by this sort of name here, right? There's going to be a default, which we may need to override or something like that. But what's nice is we're not going to be using a template, or at least we won't be exposing a template, so you don't have to see that. We don't have to worry about a mode. We'll take care of the mode ourselves. And then the variables itself, we're kind of hiding that variables, that sort of awkward sort of variables area. And we're just saying, hey, use that content here. So really, we could have actually written this out as, I wrote this out the long way, but we could have said something like node, that worked though, node SSH hosts, like this, right? So we could write out.
And I think what you would do in this resource that we're building, I think the user would be one of the attributes of that resource.
What, the user, the user as in like the owner of this thing?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
and I don't know that we could call it, owner might be the right thing. So,
okay.
Or it could be instead of calling like the name resource of, the name of that could be the user you want it to be. I'm trying to think about principle of least surprise. I think in principle of surprise, naming the resource after the user you're configuring it for is probably right.
Okay.
If I had a resource called SSH config.
Yeah.
And it was called root, then I would think it was for the root user. If it was called chef user, then I think it was called the chef user.
Maybe that.
The thing that's going to be a little tricky for you is going to be the path of that, right? Because you're going to have to figure out where the home directory is of that user.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to punt on that a little bit and say that we probably won't do that in this episode.
Yeah, that's something. Yeah,
but that would be something that you would be able to do through a shell command, right? So in your resource, you'd be able to determine what that user's home directory was, and then
put that SSH. Yeah, that's something that we might want to be able to override it, right? Like that's something in the future someone might want to be able to.
That's true, absolutely, yeah, and that could be a parameter of the SSH config. It's an optional one.
Yeah. Does this feel about right? I mean, in terms of like this right here. So you just say SSH config. It sounds like we both agree on this. So you put their username here. And then for the host, you would just kind of generically put these hosts here. Right. I think that feels all right. So let's build this.
This is one way that you could do it. The other way to think about it is that you could, instead of it saying it's a resource for the entire file, it's you could have a resource called ssh_config_host. And what that does is it's simply used to provide additional hosts to the config file for that user, and then its attributes would be user, host name, identity file. That's sort of the way that I would think about it. And then that's giving me, because that's really, again, what I care about, right? As the person that's doing it, I just want to be able to say, I need a bunch of those. And then I could loop that through an array if I wanted to pass it as attributes, if I wanted to make it be just a one thing. So in that case, it would be, yeah, exactly. It would be like that. That's how I would do that.
Yeah. The only thing I would hear is that we would say, that's the host. That's the name. That's the thing. I guess we'd still need sort of an owner.
Then you would have an owner, which could be optional. And
optional.
No, the owner probably isn't. The owner wasn't. It was the home directory. That was the home directory. So you still need the owner.
Yeah.
But it would default to. But if it's not set, then it would default to root.
Right. Whoever the current user happens to be that's applying as a chef client apply, right?
Correct.
Applying the chef client. Or whoever's running it. Yeah.
The thing that's also really nice about doing this as a resource like this is as we expand let's say that there's a new feature that we need. There's another parameter of a host configuration as an organization that we need. We can simply update it in this custom resource, rather than having to say like, oh, go back into anywhere that you've used, go back into your attributes and do that thing, and then think about all the places it exists.
Right, exactly, yeah. And then we could set defaults, right? If we had a new attribute, we could set a default, and if we did it in data, we wouldn't be able to do that. Exactly what you're saying. I think you probably said so. Yeah, if we had it in this data right here, right, and you said, oh, there's a new field that we now care about, we'd have to go back to every sort of data bag, every sort of cookbook, every sort of thing, set that value. Or I guess we could come back in here and sort of edit the template and maybe set it. So maybe it's not that big of my thought of it being like, new default to be awful. So let's do this one. I think this one seems a little more interesting.
I think so. A little more challenging. And what you can do in that custom resource you create is you'll do it will create that file and do all that stuff as well, the initial file.
Yeah.
If it doesn't already exist, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So let's do this. So chef generate, I'm going to generate an LWRP. So they're called custom resources now, but our generators call them LWRPs still. And so I'm going to call this one exactly SSH config host. And that's going to generate the two files for me, one in the providers folder and one in the resources folder. The thing is, you don't actually need the providers folder anymore. So that's a big difference. I know you were mentioning that, like having not done stuff with the new custom resources. You'll be surprised. It's just way easier. It's just all the same. So I'm going to open up that new, not the template, but I'm going to open up the new resource that we just generated, which is just going to be an empty file. So here, really everything is combined in the same file. So we're going to specify all our possible actions, our action implementation, and all our properties inside of here. So I think our actions at this point is going to be a default action. This seems like append is maybe the thing. It's like add, update. You know what I mean? Like this seems like,
right.
There could be a remove.
I think update is probably, that. Or you could think about, because that's the thing too that we need to think about is how do we want this? What's the principle of least surprise? And I actually would think it's probably going to, because what's going to happen if it's already there?
Right.
You know, how does it know to match for that? So
I feel like this is the right one to do, to say, so update is if the file's not there, it'll create the file.
we're
Maybe
talking
updates.
about, this is just, well, it'll create the file, but
Yeah.
we're talking about the entry in the file.
Yeah. That's, oh, right.
Oh, it's going to get a little trickier for us, but this
Yeah.
is the
I
thing
would
to think
say,
about. So do you remember when you were talking about writing all that sed and doing all that stuff?
mhm,
That's all stuff that you can go and hide in a custom resource,
mhm,
because it's the point of the person who knows how to do that
right.
is doing that lower level piece of that, right?
Right,
So
exactly. Yeah. I think for me, I think for this choice, I think if you specify a host name and there's one that already exists in there, I think what
it
we'd
should,
want to do is replace it, you know, like, or update it with the new content, with something
right,
that,
it will replace that
yeah,
host name. How to know whether or not it's already in there or not.
yeah, that's a difficult task to sort of think about. All right.
We're going
So
to hand wave right past that right now.
sure. Yeah, that's one of those, that's definitely a further topic and one that's going to exceed the time that we have here.
But I think that this will be a good fun foundation for that. And
Okay.
then you could pick it up later and talk about how you would be able to do update action. So we could actually, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So this is tricky. Like, in this sense, now what we need to do is we're inside of this resource. It has now been called, and there's a variable called new resource that's available to us, which contains, you know, some attributes which we actually haven't defined. We should be able to get new resource name. We should be able to get new resource user and new resource identity file. And I write these out because, you know, those are all the properties that we defined over here, right? So these are all the things that we should be able to now use and even possibly set up, you know, some gates on and things like that. So I probably should have done this, which is also say, hey, there's a property and it's called name. Name property is, yeah, which is going to be a string. And there's other restrictions we could come up with. And I think most of these are just going to be strings, so we'll just go with that. And for right now, we'll go with that. So here's user, and here's identity file. And that's something that we can look at, right? So here's like just kind of quick notes is like, to do with this identity file, we could actually check that file path to see if it exists. We could actually check if it exists. If it exists, I think with the host name, you know, if an IP is being suggested, we could actually compare this to a regular expression, you know, that might actually check it, type of thing, you know, to make sure it's a fully qualified domain name or IP address. But those are some things we could
also, for the property of name, you should set that to after string, put comma, and then put name underscore property is true. So what that's doing is, remember, we had that idea that whatever you name it, so in that case where that resource is named build server, it will take that unless it's specified, so you could remove,
comment that one right now.
Yep. And so it'll take that unless you specify the attribute of name property.
Yeah. And so this feels pretty good in terms of, so we got these resources defined. This is all just additional work we can kind of come
and are any of these required?
Yeah, it feels like, you know, if the name property, I think, is automatically required. If you don't have a name, it's not going to work. So that's kind of a bonus. You don't have to specify this.
I don't think the other ones are, because I think in this particular case, if you don't specify a host name, like SSH config will just use the name of the host that you put in, you know, the user. I don't think any of them are required at this point for us.
All right.
But we could, this is just to kind of, I just want to explain to people that if we said we want to make sure that people are setting an identity file, you can make that required.
Right, yeah, any one of those fields could become a required thing, which is, you know, important. So now that we have that, and now we have these properties are being passed from here. And I always like to think of it just like a function. So it's a function call or something like that. All this content is being sent over here. Now we need to actually do something with the content, which means we now need to actually write some content to a file, right? Like, so at some point here, it's like, let's actually write these values to the config file. But which config file, right? So that's something we don't know. Which config file are we writing? Because we need to know our destination. So what is our destination? And then we need to write this content in whatever format that needs to be. So let's figure out the first one, which is going to be, what's our destination? we said that the owner is not specified, but we're going to assume if it's not been specified, then we're going to assume it's the root user, and we're going to assume it's going to be their root path. And this is going to be a very simple version of this, but all implementations, simple at first and then grow in terms of complexity. It sounds like we kind of want a property which is called the owner property, and that is a string which is the name of the owner that's going to possibly take over. In our case, if we were to say not specify an owner, right? If I say if the new resource, and then we could set a default. Here's a benefit thing. We could say, hey, the default happens to be root.
Yeah.
So we could say, well, you were saying, what is the destination? The thought is we could run a command, right? We could run a command here that says ask for the owner's
home directory.
Home directory, right? Yeah. I'm not sure the exact process that would be, right? We'd have to actually shell out to do a command, right? And we'd have to say shell out, and then I'm not familiar with the Unix command for that. That's one thing.
Well, and the thing is, it may be something, and just to if you did there may, anyway, the point being that potentially on different platforms you might do that in a different way. So this is another advantage of it being in a resource.
Sure.
We could go and we could grab the plat, right? And then
yeah. Let's see if we can, oops, I'm gonna save this file. I'm gonna close this over here, oops, on the left, and get just the resource open. Here we go. And then on the right, I'm gonna log into the system, and let me move this up slightly. I'm guessing our big fat heads block a portion of this. I've not done a Google Hangout on here, so I don't know. So here, I can do pwd, and that will return for me as the current user. But is there a command, like, I guess when you say sudo, or if I was the root user, sudo su. If I was this user, is there a way to say like su, and this is where I don't know the su command very well. Su, and then the command, I could say something like su vagrant, I believe that's a user on the system. I could say to it, hey, run pwd. Okay, right, and then I could run this right here. I don't know if this is the right way. Oh, is the root user home vagrant? Oh, that's current working directory. How do you find your home directory? Oh, is it more like echo the env of your home?
So.
Oh, oops, I forgot. This is where I show my ignorance here. It's in the pass WD. Okay, so we could do that, right? So we could look at the pass WD, etc pass WD, and we could say, hey,
okay,
based on
the other thing you could do, try eval space echo, then in quotes tilde vagrant.
Tilde vagrant?
Yep.
No.
Oh, one word. Yeah.
Echo.
Echo. No. Yeah. And then no. Echo is not in quotes.
Okay. Okay.
And then in quotes tilde vagrant, if that's the user, right? There you go.
All right. And so is that something you could just put?
You could just run it. Yeah. So it's basically output of that command is what's going to tell you.
All right. So to find out that destination, we'd actually have to do this right here. So at shell out, run this command, which is this, and then insert into here our username. So I'm going to put that. You're trying to be so helpful, you editor, aren't you?
I know, right?
And then we're going to say owner. So we're going to say new resource owner right there. Okay.
Watch your, are those single ticks gonna screw up your interpolation or no?
No, they should be all right. I just want to make sure, does that work with single ticks here? It's not special, right? I don't think. No, okay. No, it'll be all right. It won't hurt you mean the Ruby interpolation for that?
Yeah, yeah.
No, that should be okay. I think that'll be all right for us.
Okay.
And that'll give us the result back. So this is the home directory, the current user that we're working on. And then we could use that value now. So we have that home directory. So the
So
SSH.
we need to make sure that the SSH directory is there first.
Oh, right. So we would want
Remember,
to
you
say,
did that in your recipe before, but we want to ensure that it's there.
and it's got the right permissions. So we could do this. We could say,
You could just
hey,
steal that's that top stanza there. Yeah.
yeah, right
steal
there.
that guy.
Right. And then this is now changed from here much more clear too, which I like, is home directory, right?
Yeah.
So now it's just to say, make sure that's all there.
And then set owner to new underscore resource.owner. We hadn't set the owner on that directory before, so.
Right, because we assumed it was root. So
right.
This feels pretty good. All right, so that directory comes up with the .sh. We've got that, and we've based on the home directory here. Again, this has some problems. It isn't platform compatible across everywhere, but it works for us for this implementation. We have some tests. We'll run this. And then we now have the directory. We now need the file, and we need the content within that file, right? So now we need to actually write the file stuff in there. So for us, it seems like we could just append the content, right? So, but in this case, update, we might have chosen too big of a sort of thing to chew off, right? Because update means read the current file.
Yeah, I would say let's make this be action is create, right?
Let's do create.
So what it'll do in theory, what this should do is it's going to blow away anything that's already there. And so what we'll need to do as a later exercise is figuring out how you can tell if the resource is already in the file.
Right.
And that's using, there's a, I think, I'll when I stop being tongue-tied, I'll remember how it is.
Sure.
Well, there's this load current value concept, right? So that would let us go ahead and read the value that's already in
the content there. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a kind of a to-do here, which is if we were really going to do an update, is we'd have to load the contents of the existing SSH config file, right? So whatever .ssh config, I think that's what you're getting at. And then we'd have to load the content, and then we'd have to parse it. So we'd actually probably parse it a little bit, turn it into whatever entries of information that we need, whether what hosts exist already, and then we'd have to go through and replace those hosts or write those hosts again. I think that's right. That's kind of like where we're going. But this seems like an easy way, which is like we're just gonna blow away the file. So first implementation seems right. Okay, so that would be more for the update action that we might do. So to write this to the file, really, it seems like we would just go back to our recipe, right? Like if I was starting out with my initial thing, I'm really just taking this template again, and I'm just going to write this file. And I'm going to say, hey, now I want you to write these hosts to the file. This will create one and only one, but it won't append it. So this will, I wonder. In this case, it feels like we still need to load the contents of the file. What if we just didn't check for duplicates at this moment? What if we just sort of added a new entry as create does? That's not the best least of surprise, but it seems like we can't have this resource blow away, things every single time, right? So this right here, if I specified a new SSH config, this type of thing. Let me delete some of these comments out now. Right, so if I did this and I set up another one right afterwards, we wouldn't want to blow away the SSH file again. Worst case is it would just keep adding entries to it. Best case, it would be replacing, at least for me, the principal least surprise says, best case for me, it would sort of update any build hosts that are already in the file, but it wouldn't keep appending it. Right now, appending it seems like an okay thing that I'm all right with seeing. So,
yeah.
Okay. So I think for that, we really then, a template won't work because a template is going to replace the contents of this file every single time. We're in trouble at this point. Like we are going to have some, it's not going to work for us as content-wise because if we run this twice, we're essentially going to blow away this thing. So this feels like we need to write some Ruby code to do it, which means it feels like we need to read the file, right? So I'm going to do some sort of read the contents of the file. We're not going to parse it yet.
Yeah, and that's what load current value will do, right? You can do.
You're talking about for custom resources, you can do this load current value.
Right. Oh, you're doing this in the, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but we need. I'll maybe refactor that. I'm gonna do it in a Ruby sort of ugly Ruby way here for the last few minutes we have. Read the contents of the file. After I read the contents of the file, I'm going to render the content that I want to, the new resource content, right, in the format to append to file, and then I'm going to write the I'm going to append the formatted content to this formatted, I don't want to use the word content again, but append the formatted resource information, new resource information, to the file contents that we just loaded. And then we're going to save that file contents again. So save the contents of the file. Right, that seems about right, like sort of the process we've walked through. Now, here's something that gets a little tricky is that we're going to be writing Ruby to do this, right? I'm going to be using Ruby to kind of read the contents of this file. And in the same way, like this other one, the shell out, I mean, I've got to read the contents of this file. So I'm going to use the home directory. And there's a problem with what I'm doing here, but let's just write this out. We take the home directory, and I'm going to assume inside the home directory .ssh, and then I'm assuming here it's going to be config, right? Again, those are things we might want to make configurable.
I was just going to say, and also for those following along at home, we could put basically some guards around it, do some file exist, right? Don't try to read the file if we don't check for it first, stuff like that too. But
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Then we could essentially go down another path. So yeah, there's a to do here, which is like, yeah, file does not exist, create the file, or assume no content, right? That kind of thing. And then, oh yeah, the way I'm going about it, we could actually have just done a file write. I realized there's a shorter version of this. Thanks for bringing that up. The shorter version of this would be use Ruby's file append to append the content to the end of the file. But that's not so great. Let's go with this kind of like, well, I guess I'm doing the same thing anyways. This is tricky.
Yeah, right now we're factoring it with that it's just going to make another entry if the entry already exists.
Yeah, let's go with that. I think there's an easier version, but I'm going to go with this one because I think there's going to be more value. Now we can't, or it's not a good idea, it feels like, for me to run this just file read out in the open like this, at least to me, because we got to remember that Ruby code is going to be run at a different time, right? So when this directory resource essentially gets read in, it gets added to the resource collection, but it doesn't immediately get executed. So we might not even have that .ssh directory, might not have the config file yet. Right. So it feels like we got to put this inside of a Ruby block. So all this code, this Ruby code that we're writing, needs to go into a Ruby block, I believe, right? So you name a Ruby block, I guess. Maybe. I haven't written a Ruby block, actually, in honesty. So in this case, this is going to be, I'll just call the Ruby block, which is going to be read and update the SSH config. And inside of here is where we're going to do all this kind of crazy Ruby work.
I mean, you do have to name it, but that's fine.
Yeah. So we've read the contents of the file, so that sort of takes care of this. We'll deal with the to-do of like doesn't exist, and we'll write a test for that. That's what the beauty of tests are for, and we'll get to that after we get this done.
Don't forget you have to do the block do around it as well.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. A block do. That's what doesn't need a name. Thank you very much. Power of having a co-host. All right. And now let's render the new resource in the format to append to the file. So this is where we would actually take the content here, and we would say, hey, this needs to look like, right? These fields right here need to be written out in a way that will essentially just be easily appended to the file. So this could be something like, let's just write it out here in line, and then we'll refactor. So in this case, really it's going to be host, right? Like host new resource name. And I'm going to switch this over. Double quotes I like, but then for multiple lines, I kind of like using this like different syntax slightly. And this is it's going to be a little ugly here. And like I said,
that's why we do red, green, refactor.
Yeah, it's going to be a little ugly. So host is there. Then after host, we put host name, right? And here again, so we're kind of doing almost what we did before. User, right? I can probably surround that text. And then I'm going to grab this identity file. And then here, I'll do that. Okay, that
You know
feels...
what? There's a maybe I'm wrong, but like, how are we gonna handle your white spacing in here? Because I'm trying to remember if that config file
matters. The white space matters. I think it's okay because this new line, this is essentially, that's on a line. And this will be appended. We'll take a look and see what so this is essentially the new host information. I'll just call this the host information or host data. And so we've rendered it as that. Now we want to append that content. And so it seems like I would just take file contents and I would say file contents equals file content plus this new host information. But we need a new line character in between there. So usually, it's kind of strange in Ruby. You would probably do this versus that other one, even though it feels like more characters. But most people do that versus the plus instead of the plus operator. And then we want to save the contents of the file. So in this case, I would say file write, I believe. And I would specify that same path again. And I would specify the content that goes along with it. And of course, there's options to append or whatever, but we're just going to rewrite all that content. Oh boy. Well, this is much uglier, but I love it. All right, so I think let's try running this and see sort of the problems that we've wrought for ourselves at this moment. Let me make sure we've got everything set up here, and I've got a bunch of others that have commented out. So I'm going to comment out this original implementation, right? Creating the home directory or the SSH directory and then the config file with the template. I'm going to comment that out. And we're just going to rely on the custom resource now, SSH config host, to run this and build this content here. So let's do a kitchen converge and a kitchen verify. So I'm going to start slowly. I'm just going to run the kitchen converge.
Yeah,
I think
just to make sure it doesn't die in a fire.
Yeah, there might be a typo or two throughout there, and that's probably right. SSH config host. There's one thing that I forgot. With custom resources, so it tells us that there's an error here. It tells me no resource or this found. Here inside of this, I believe I need to give it some value, which I forget. Maybe name, like name this. And that's something, if you've got the docs open.
It's
resource underscore name, perhaps.
Resource underscore name.
Yeah.
It's resource underscore name.
Yeah, resource underscore name. So we specify the name, because otherwise what happens is Chef thinks that this resource is actually called SSH and then uses the file name to figure that out. So it actually was calling SSH config host. Oh,
yep.
Well, why don't we actually just rename this file then? So we actually, let me make sure this passes, or at least breaks in a different way. I like when it breaks in a different way. Let's see, does that error, it tells me there is a problem. It doesn't look like it's a problem that we saw before. It looks like there's a problem. No undefined method read for chef resource file class. Ooh, I'm so glad we got that error, because this is something that comes up. Let me just pause for a moment. We'll fix this error, but here's something we could have done. We can rely on the file conventions, and I could just say, hey, call this config host. And I believe we don't even need this resource name. So I think we're going to get the same error, which is undefined method read across this thing. So let's just make sure we get that same wonderful error. Yep, we do. So you can use or rely on the file name structure to sort of figure out the host name, or you can or the resource name, or you can specify it. Okay, so here's a good error message, and this one comes up quite a bit when working with Chef, and some questions that come up with working with it. It says here, file class. So Chef resource file class doesn't have a read method. But of course, you're freaking out, and you're going like, and if you've had this error before, you're like, well, I know this is Ruby code, right? And I'm going to go to Ruby docs, and I'm going to look up this thing, and I'm going to look at the core language for Ruby, the standard library, and I'm going to look for the file class. And in the file class, you're going to look at all these methods. And one of the methods is absolutely read, but it should be read. I think it's under IO if it's not eventually here. So there is a read method that's available, but the thing is, I think what's important to note, yep, and it's going to be in read, made available by the IO object. The thing is, notice that this is Ruby's thing. So the file is not the same file. This is chef : resource : file class, not the file class itself. So here's something that you oftentimes see in source code. And what we need to do is make sure that when we mention the file resource or file sort of class here, that we use these 2 colons in front of it. And the 2 colons are going to say, almost like a slash, in a directory. It says, go back to the original sort of scope of, just the Ruby one. Because right now, what it's assuming is chef : resource : file. What we want to say is, no, don't assume it's in this local area. Reset yourself, take yourself all the way back out. And this should use the Ruby related file. So if you ever see that in recipes, I remember seeing that. I mean, I understood it, but it's always a question that comes up quite a bit when looking at it.
I can't remember the last time I saw it, but
all right. So
repressed it.
Yeah. Oh, good. It looks like we're getting a new error, which is great. We're not getting an error related to, at least it tells me, it looks like we're not getting a related error to the thing that we saw before. So it's telling us error executing action run on resource Ruby block, read and update SSH config. No such file or directory, mixlib shellout. So I'm using this wrong. So something I did wrong here is that you'll notice it says mixlib shellout object / that's not a directory. Mixlib shellout /.sh /config. I think what I did wrong is this right here. This is the home directory, but I didn't grab the standard out from that command. Right? So like shellout will shell out for you, build that command object, but then you have to say, give me the standard
error.
It
just returned what the command was that you built.
Yeah, that command object that I built for me. So, all right, and this probably fails too. I bet there's some like additional characters or spaces. We have to figure it out. So
okay, error correcting. Okay,
let me scroll to the top one here. Yeah, that's the top one here. No such file or directory /root, and then notice there's a it says /root. And then it says /.sh config. I think there's some space characters, at least a new line character coming back in that standard out, right? So that's right here, and then it jumps. Yeah, we need to trim a little detail off of this line here. So we got to take this line, and then there's in Ruby there's strip. So there's L strip, which is from the left side. There's R strip, and then there's a strip. So I'm just going to go strip. And that should take care of all the white space characters from the beginning and the end, if there happens to be any. And hopefully, that'll create the directory we want. And that does. So those are some good errors and some ones that I've seen, particularly if you're dealing with standard out, or if you're dealing with shell out, number one, you've got to strip the content a lot of times. You might even have to do a little more processing of that content inside of Ruby. And then, of course, number two, as we saw, this sort of Ruby thing, which I think is interesting, is that you have to put these colons to make sure you sort of change the scope of which file do you mean. Do you mean file at the top level that Ruby defined, or the file that's sort of local within the chef resource? And I think we've got it, right? So let's just verify that and see if it works. And nothing changed, so I mean, I don't know the difference in this, but I'd like to create a error for ourselves, if you don't mind.
So in theory, well, if it didn't do anything, then it's still going to pass because it passed before.
Mm-hmm.
So, but let's take a look at what that config file looks like, because actually, in theory, we should see that entry twice.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. So I'm going to become the root user.
Wait, did we read it in and then append it, or did we just blow the whole thing away?
No, we read it and append it.
So we should see the build server in there twice.
Yeah, so here's the .sh, and here's the config. Yep, build server. And it keeps adding more build servers. So if we run this again or converge this again, our test is, of course, just going to keep adding a new line to it. Now you'll notice, because we're using this custom resource and we're using the Ruby block to do this, we're not going to see that sort of template output that we got before. So that's something that's interesting or different. So here, so let me log back into the system. Sudo, can I just see it as this? Sudo cat root.
Cat, I was just going to say, just do.
Yeah, config. There we go. So we're continuing to add that here. But that's really nice in the sense of like what we started with. Now, this is where, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so when you want to go to the next level to not have it just adding it every time, what you would probably do would do a check and say, if I see the line, because we know that every one of them is going to at least start with the host block, right, of that stanza. And it will end with the next time that the word host shows up. So you could say, if I already see it, then what I should do is I should probably just blow that stanza away and then append. If I don't match it, then just append.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not going to go and update line by line, because you're going to just sort of assume that, so really it's, you're going to basically assume that the parameters were set. Now, the one thing that could be weird is if you're saying like, well, I'm going to assume that it's there and I only want to add in a new identity file, but whatever was just, actually, that's where it's going to get a little tricksy.
Yeah, I think ultimately the more sort of more control you want over that file, and the more ability that you want to be able to update and sort of manage it, means that you might at some point need to be writing some like essentially a Ruby class, that's going to be able to parse the contents of that file, render it as a data format of some type, and then you can sort of manipulate that data format and then write that to the file, right? So a long-term version of this might be like, I write a Ruby gem that can actually, or I find a Ruby gem that can read SSH config files, turn it all into data, names and properties, values and things like that, and then allow me to manipulate that and then save that content or dump that content back down to a file. That's something I think long-term. And there might even be like a Ruby gem that already does this, right? That's one of those things where if you think about it, before you do it, you might be like, is there anything that deals with SSH config? And there might be quickly add, let you quick add it, right? So this might be one. You have to be a little wary, of course, of downloads and things like that. This was worked on a long time ago, but this might be the start of some project that could do that work, right? Like, it looks like it gives you a bunch of commands along with it, but it probably has within this, some sort of library that's able to parse that content. You could bring that Ruby gem in to sort of read that content. So
I think the thing to think about with this is that, is this specific use case one where I would sit and write a custom resource to do that? I don't know.
Yeah.
I might do it if I'm wanting to create like a community cookbook that does this or something like that. In my organization, this is probably not a specific use case, but you're seeing the idea. This was a lot simpler to think about than saying like, yeah, managing a Tomcat instance or something like that. But the idea is, I'm making it so that someone who just wants to leverage this can just use it.
Yeah.
Whereas I have the specific knowledge of how to manipulate this particular config file.
Right,
or
exactly.
how to put in the things that I know that I care about. So even if I do have to write some extra logic in there to check for the things, that's okay, because I'm the one who knows that. But I'm not making everybody have to do that. So I'm just sort of slicing up the work.
Yeah,
at the level of domain expertise.
Yeah, and I think that what the beauty of that is that, this implementation over here, so ignoring the craziness that starts to form over here, right? And there's a lot more craziness that would come with all the to-dos if we started answering those. This creates a very beautiful, like implementation, right? So that, like you're describing, you, Matt, if you wrote this, you would be able to maintain that craziness, all that sort of, deeper knowledge of file structure, location, and things like that. And me as someone else who comes to this file, I would be able to just read this and understand this very easily that, okay, so you're setting up a host that's called build server with all this sort of connection information. I don't need to know that it's 2 spaces indented and it's all this other sort of content that goes along with it. I'm free to sort of just think in terms of like, just the data, just the insertion of like, solving problems and not these other things. So
and also from a validation perspective, as you talked about way earlier, is let's say that identity file is a required field for an SSH config. Let's just pretend for a minute. So if I, in my custom resource, make that a required field, if I try to use that, Chef is going to throw an error for me and is going to say, hey, you tried to, so it's catching me there, not like, it's not going to just happily chug away and then 3 days later I try to actually do an SSH and find out that my file was wrong.
Right, exactly. That's one of those things like this, and here's a good example of it. Let's do that. Let's, if I just comment this out.
And we should get an error. And let's
and I say that's required. Yeah, this is one of those things where, there's a lot more to custom resources in terms of specifying that functionality like you're describing. So there's so much to it. And yeah, for me, I see so much power in just, being able to explicitly declare your intentions. And it tells you here, identity file is
required. So that's a crystal clear error for me. I could say, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, right. SSH config build server, trying to do that. That's something's actionable versus like what you're exactly describing, that scenario where it writes something completely messed up, you don't find it for 3 days. Right, I could see that, yeah. Well, I think we've gone way over time, but I think it was great in terms of like what we were going through, figuring it out. Matt, thank you very much for joining me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would be remiss if I didn't, do a little
Plug it.
promotion.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if you've watched this all the way to the end, you're hearing this. But yeah, feel free to check out my podcast, Arrested DevOps. We're in the iTunes store. We're in Google Play Music, and we talk about all kinds of DevOpsy stuff, not just Chef, but it's a lot of fun. And we're gonna have Franklin on the show one of these days for sure.
All right. I look forward to it. Well, thank you everybody that listened, followed along, watched. I appreciate you being here. Thanks for hanging out as long as you did, and in our new format here. Hopefully, I'll check the video later, see how it worked. I'm a stickler. I want to make sure everything looks great and works well. So, as always, happy automating. Take care of yourselves. Bye.